You're not heartless. You're not cold. You're not emotionally unavailable. You're afraid. Afraid of falling in love, not because love is weak, not because you're above it, but because real love is a mirror. And that mirror doesn't just reflect beauty. It reflects your shame, your guilt, your deepest fears, the parts of you you've buried so deep, even you pretend they're not there. Love is not a comfort zone. It's a war zone. And you've already been wounded there. Once, maybe twice, or worse, many times. And every time you got up, you told yourself, never again. Because the last time someone said, I love you, it wasn't safety, it was setup. It didn't end in healing, it ended in collapse. Not just of the relationship, but of your sense of self. There's a man early 30s. Financially stable, physically fit, socially respected. On the outside, he has it all. But he hasn't been in a serious relationship in 5 years. Not since the night his fiancée left him. After he opened up about the abuse he faced as a child, she said, "That's a lot to carry. I don't think I'm ready for that kind of responsibility." And she left. Not because he failed her, but because he let her see him. And it cost him everything. So now he doesn't date. Not seriously. Not deeply. He sleeps with women he doesn't care about. Because caring is now a liability. This isn't a rom-com. This is trauma management. Let's be real. This fear isn't poetic. It's paralytic. It keeps you staring at texts you'll never send, composing messages in your head that never see daylight. It's that ache in your chest when someone finally sees you, and instead of leaning in, you vanish. You ghost. You self-destruct. Why? Because you believe that the closer someone gets, the more they'll eventually use that closeness to destroy you. Seneca once said, "He who fears death will never live." The same is true of love. He who fears heartbreak will never connect. He who avoids pain forfeits meaning. But here's what Stoics understood deeply. Suffering isn't the enemy. Avoidance is. When you avoid love to avoid pain, you also avoid transformation. You avoid the one thing love forces you to confront, who you really are when your armor is gone. So instead, you choose safe people. People who don't challenge you. People who don't light your soul on fire. People who won't hurt you because they're not even close enough to try. But here's the paradox. You're not choosing safety. You're choosing emotional starvation. You're not protecting yourself from heartbreak. You're guaranteeing it slowly, silently, and endlessly. A 26-year-old woman finally meets a man who sees her. Not her appearance, not her performance. Her soul. She tells him about her depression, her suicidal thoughts. He listens. He doesn't run. He tells her he loves her because of her vulnerability, not in spite of it. And that's when she ends it. Coldly, abruptly. Blocked him on everything. Why? She told her therapist, "If he truly sees me and still loves me, that means I have to let go of the story that I'm unlovable. And I don't know who I am without that story." That's the reality. Some people would rather stay lonely than found. Because being found means becoming someone new. And that is terrifying. The deepest layer of all. So let me ask you, what are you really afraid of? It's not just heartbreak. It's ego death. It's identity collapse. It's the terrifying possibility that love might not just break your heart. It might reconstruct your entire worldview. And that change, that surrender, that unraveling, might be the most painful thing you'll ever survive. You're not heartless. You're not broken. You're just someone who's been taught by pain, by betrayal, by abandonment. That love is a risk you can't afford. But here's the haunting question. What if that fear is exactly what's keeping you from becoming who you were always meant to be? The layers of fear. 1. Fear of losing control. You meet someone who makes your heartbeat skip. They're not just attractive. They see you beneath the persona, beneath the defenses. And instead of butterflies, you feel dread. Why? Because falling in love is surrender. And for people who've spent years constructing walls to survive, love doesn't feel like flying. It feels like being hunted, cornered, exposed. Meet Jonathan. 34, built a multi-million-dollar tech company from scratch. Wakes up at 4:30 a.m., reads Stoicism, deadlifts 400 pounds. By all measures, he's unshakable. Controlled, efficient, untouchable. Until he meets Clara. She doesn't chase him. She listens. She doesn't need him. She understands him. She laughs at his sarcasm and touches his arm in a way that lingers longer than logic. And for the first time in over a decade, he opens up. He tells her about the childhood bullying, the alcoholic mother, the night he watched his dad walk out for good. He bleeds in front of her. The next day, he blocks her number, vanishes. Why? He later confesses to a friend, "I've fought to be in control my whole life. The moment I felt seen, I felt weak. I can't afford to need anyone. Because when you need someone, you give them the power to destroy you." That's the terrifying truth. You don't fear love. You fear losing the illusion of self-sufficiency. You fear emotional dependence, because it puts your identity at risk. Isabella is a high-performing attorney. Hyper-independent, elegant, sharp. She leads teams, wins cases, and makes six figures. But she keeps dating emotionally distant men. Because men who are cold never ask for her truth. They never ask her to melt. They never make her question the one thing she's terrified to give up: control over her image. Then she meets Marcus. Sweet, kind, emotionally intelligent. He brings her flowers. He remembers the little things. He doesn't play games. And she panics. She starts pulling away. Picks fights, gets too busy. She tells herself, "He's too soft. I need someone strong." But the truth is, she couldn't handle the intimacy. Why? Because when someone loves you genuinely, they don't love the role you play. They love the raw version you've been hiding. And that's terrifying. It is not that we are given a short life, but we make it short by wasting it in fear. Seneca. The fear of losing control is rooted in the ego's greatest illusion, that autonomy equals invulnerability. Stoicism teaches mastery over desire, not disconnection from it. True strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to carry it without self-destruction. Control is a survival tactic. Love is a surrender. And the human soul wasn't made to live in a fortress. Hidden truth. When you reject love out of fear of losing control, you're not protecting yourself. You're starving yourself. You're trading intimacy for predictability, depth for safety, and meaning for mastery. Shocking thought. Most people who fear losing control in love will chase success, grind endlessly, or obsess over fitness. Not because they're ambitious, but because they're desperately trying to fill a void they're too scared to trust someone else to touch. A war veteran once said this after falling in love for the first time post-combat. "In the field, I faced death. I looked it in the eye and didn't flinch. But when she looked at me, really looked at me, I was terrified. Because bullets only threaten your body, but love threatens your entire identity. That's the real battlefield. And losing control in love isn't weakness. It's the ultimate act of courage. The question is, will you risk becoming soft in a world that taught you hardness as the only form of survival? 2. Fear of being seen, and then abandoned, expanded. Real love doesn't flatter your mask. It strips it. It doesn't fall in love with who you pretend to be. It wants the messy, unscripted, unfiltered version you've spent years hiding. And that is terrifying. Because what if someone finally sees all of you? Your childhood wounds, your irrational anxieties, the way your voice shakes when you're scared. And then they walk away anyway? That's not just rejection. That's annihilation. Let's rewind. Because fear of being seen and then abandoned is rarely born in adulthood. It's programmed. A little boy grows up in a house where he's praised only when he's silent. He learns, "My emotions make people uncomfortable." So he builds a personality of calmness, logic, and strength. But inside, he's terrified of being emotional because every time he was, someone withdrew. A girl gets affection from her parents only when she gets good grades, dresses neatly, and smiles politely. Her inner child learns, "My worth is based on what I do, not who I am." So she becomes a high achiever, a perfectionist. But deep down, she's never been loved for her chaos, only her performance. By the time these kids become adults, love isn't freedom. It's audition. What injures the hive injures the bee. Marcus Aurelius. We are not isolated souls. We are shaped by the collective. When the people who first taught us love also taught us to hide who we are, we carry those blueprints into every relationship, sabotaging closeness to protect ourselves from annihilation. Because to be truly seen is to gamble everything. And for many, it feels safer to be admired at a distance than loved up close. Alyssa was beautiful, intelligent, and charismatic. Men fell for her easily, but none ever lasted past the 3rd month. Not because they were wrong for her, but because they got too close. One man, David, once asked, "What's something no one knows about you?" She panicked. She changed the subject. 2 days later, she ghosted him. Privately, she journaled, "If I tell him who I really am, he'll leave. So I'll leave first." Alyssa had been sexually abused as a teenager by a close family friend. No one ever believed her, so she learned a brutal lesson. Truth, isolation, vulnerability, betrayal. Now, as an adult, Love felt like re-entering the scene of the crime. Not because the new man would hurt her, but because her inner child expected him to. Michael had the physique of a warrior. Disciplined, stoic, successful. But his relationships always ended in silence. One night, a girlfriend cried in front of him, overwhelmed by anxiety. He sat there frozen, didn't touch her, didn't speak. She left 2 weeks later. When his therapist asked why he shut down, he said, "I didn't know if she'd still respect me if I let her see I was scared too." Michael's father was a military vet, cold, distant, emotionally rigid. Love in that household meant obedience, strength, and suppression. So Michael's adult brain wired intimacy with danger. Because what if, in one unguarded moment, he's exposed as not enough? If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Marcus Aurelius. Most people aren't afraid of being rejected. They're afraid of being known and then rejected. Why? Because it confirms their deepest fear. I am unworthy as I am. So instead, they build romantic walls and disguise them as boundaries. They date people who never ask real questions. They prefer texting over talking. They hide behind humor, sarcasm, sex, or busyness. Because if no one really sees you, then no one can ever really abandon you. Only the version you created. And that feels safer. But it's also the loneliest prison in the world. Here's the most brutal truth of all. Many people would rather suffer loneliness than risk being seen nakedly, spiritually, emotionally, and then be told, "You're too much. You're not enough. You're hard to love." But until that fear is faced, you'll keep attracting the same safe, shallow connections. And you'll keep pushing away the people who dare to see you beyond the performance. 3. Fear of repeating the past. When history doesn't heal, it haunts. Some wounds don't just hurt, they educate. And the lesson they teach is this: never feel that deeply again. The truth is, betrayal isn't just an event. It's a reprogramming of the soul. You think you've moved on. You think time heals. But then someone says just the right words, smiles just the same way, and suddenly, you're right back there, bleeding from a wound that no one else can see. Let's break this down. Your mind remembers, but your body never forgets. You can go to therapy, read books, convince yourself you've grown, but your nervous system doesn't run on logic. It runs on association. And if the last time you let someone in, it ended in humiliation, manipulation, or betrayal, then falling in love feels like walking back into a burning house. With a smile, Stoicism teaches us this: we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Seneca. But what happens when the imagination is formed by real trauma? That's not cowardice. That's emotional PTSD. There was a man who grew up hiding his emotions because in his home, vulnerability was punished. His father mocked weakness. His mother dismissed pain. Fast forward. He meets a woman in his late 20s. She seems kind, soft, safe. He does something he's never done before. He talks about how he was neglected. He tells her he sometimes fears he's not good enough. She comforts him. But 3 months later, during an argument, she snaps, "No wonder your dad never loved you. You're pathetic." Those words didn't just hurt. They detonated every defense he'd ever built. He didn't just leave the relationship. He left romantic hope itself. Now, he sleeps around, keeps it light, not because he's a player, but because connection is a loaded weapon he'll never hand over again. Another woman, 31, gets into therapy after a toxic 5-year relationship. The man she loved was charismatic, romantic, and emotionally sadistic. He would say, "No one will ever love you like I do," then disappear for days. Eventually, she left him, rebuilt, met a guy who seemed different, sweet, soft-spoken, loyal. But 2 years in, he starts subtly mirroring the same patterns, ignoring her in front of friends, weaponizing her insecurities, making her question her own memories. She realized something horrifying. She didn't find him by accident. Her brain chose familiarity over safety, because chaos felt like home. That's the reality for many. You don't attract what you deserve. You attract what you've been trained to tolerate. The things we fear the most have already happened. When you fear falling in love again, it's not fear of something new. It's the echo of something old, the echoing with more power than it had the first time. Epictetus said, "When something happens, the only thing in your power is how you respond." But love complicates that, because love rewrites your identity. It gives someone access to the control panel of your emotions. And when someone abuses that access, your response becomes less about choice and more about survival. A man gets engaged to a woman who seems supportive, grounded, intelligent. She encourages his business, helps him reconnect with a strange family, even starts managing his finances. But slowly, subtly, she starts eroding his sense of self. She tells him he's imagining things when he catches her texting her ex. She says he's too emotional when he expresses doubt. She calls his therapy a waste of money. After the wedding is planned and deposits are paid, she cheats. When confronted, she smirks. "I knew you'd screw this up eventually. You always do." Now, he's single. But not because he wants to be. Because trust feels lethal. He says, "Falling in love now feels like handing someone a knife and asking them to carve their name into my chest and hoping they don't go too deep. You might think the solution is to heal first. But here's what most people don't understand. Healing doesn't mean the fear disappears. It means you learn to see it, name it, and not obey it. But most don't even get that far, because by the time someone healthy shows up, the trauma response already whispers, "Don't trust this. It's too good. It's going to end just like last time." And sometimes, we'd rather sabotage a potential future than relive the past in 4K. The obstacle is the way. Marcus Aurelius. To those with emotional scars, love will always feel dangerous. But the Stoics remind us, the very thing we fear may be the gateway to freedom, if we dare to face it, not avoid it. So here's the question. What if your fear of love isn't weakness, but the scarred proof that you once had the courage to love fully and survive? 4. Fear of losing yourself expanded. Love is supposed to complete us, right? Wrong. That's not love. That's codependency in disguise. A fantasy sold by broken people trying to glue their pieces together through someone else. We don't just fear heartbreak. We fear obliteration. The quiet death of who we are, smiling on the outside, disappearing on the inside. It starts slow. You compromise once, then twice. You cancel that trip, delay that goal, bite your tongue. Soon your dreams become silly, your hobbies become a waste of time, and your ambition starts to feel selfish. And one day you wake up next to someone you love, and you can't even remember who you are anymore. Hannah, 28, an artist, world traveler, free spirit. She had built a life around expression, independence, and connection. Then she met Ryan, a man who provided the one thing she never had: predictability. He didn't demand she change, but he didn't understand her need to create either. He was calm, steady, grounded. The kind of man who didn't want a gypsy soul, but a quiet, stable home. So she stayed, traded exhibitions for dinner parties, replaced painting with errands, canceled her trip to Bali for a mortgage meeting. 10 years passed. She hadn't held a brush in 6. When she finally looked in the mirror, she broke down. "I gave up my wings to be loved by someone who never asked me to fly." That's the paradox. She was never forced. She chose it out of fear. Fear that if she stayed true to herself, she'd end up alone. Stoic insight. If you have to trade your essence for connection, it's not love. It's spiritual suicide. Marcus Aurelius paraphrased, Shamal Tartifanti. He was a passionate man, loved music, loved ideas, started his own podcast, had a day job, spent his nights building a community online. Then he fell in love with a woman who didn't like loud things, didn't like his friends, didn't like the spotlight, so he dimmed himself, stopped posting, avoided conflict, told himself he was maturing. One night, at a dinner party, someone asked him, "What do you love doing these days?" He froze. He couldn't answer, because he hadn't done anything for himself in years. That night, he wrote in his journal, "I traded my fire for peace. Now I have neither." Melissa, 32, high-performing lawyer, fiercely independent. She was always told she was too much. Then came Daniel, charming, sweet, seemingly supportive. But his support came with subtle sabotage. He'd say, "You work too hard, babe, why don't you relax?" Or, "Do you really need to go out again? Don't you want us time?" It didn't sound abusive. It sounded like love. But slowly her edge dulled. She became agreeable. Less vocal, less opinionated, more digestible. When she finally tried to break it off, he said, "I liked you better before you got all feminist again." That's when it hit her. He didn't fall in love with her. He fell in love with the idea of taming her. Stoic psychological insight. The greatest violence is not physical. It's the slow erosion of your soul, disguised as affection. Epictetus modernized. This fear isn't irrational. It's learned. If you've been rewarded for self-sacrifice, you'll associate love with diminishing yourself, especially if your childhood taught you that being agreeable meant being loved, while being authentic meant being rejected. So now when you start falling in love, your nervous system panics. It says, "Danger, you're about to disappear again." And you run not because you don't want love, but because you're afraid you'll become a passenger in your own life. The stoic truth few are willing to admit. To be loved at the cost of your character is a betrayal disguised as belonging. Seneca. Adapted. The Stoics believed in self-possession, that your mind, your choices, and your essence should remain untouchable by the outside world. So when love starts to erode those foundations, when it asks you to blend in, dim down, or shrink, it's no longer love. It's just a prettier form of slavery. And that's why. The fear is real, not childish, not cynical. Wise? But if you don't understand it, it will keep you trapped between craving connection and fearing annihilation. 5. Fear of being trapped in a game you can't win expanded. Modern dating is no longer about love. It's a war disguised as flirtation, a performance disguised as intimacy, where affection is rationed and emotions are currency, where the one who cares less wins. This isn't a fair fight. It's psychological warfare. Let's break it down. Subtle ghosting, the art of vanishing without consequence. Breadcrumbing, giving someone just enough attention to keep them hanging. Love bombing, intense flattery followed by cold withdrawal to manufacture confusion. Gaslighting, making you question your instincts, your perceptions, your reality. And here's the terrifying truth. Most people today aren't dating to connect. They're dating to outlast, to outmaneuver, to win a game of emotional chicken where the first to fall loses. And if you've ever been the one who fell first, you know what happens next. You lose your dignity, your balance, sometimes your entire sense of self. A man in his late 20s meets a woman who seems like a breath of fresh air. No games, no red flags, just peace. For the first time in years, he allows himself to be vulnerable. He opens up about his father's death, his fear of failure, his past relationships. She holds space for him, listens, encourages. He starts to think, maybe this is real, maybe I can breathe. Then one day, nothing. Texts go unanswered. Calls ignored. The warmth vanishes like it was never there. 3 weeks later, he runs into her at a mutual friend's party. She says, "I needed to protect myself. I felt like I was catching feelings and I couldn't let that happen." Translation? She couldn't risk losing the power. She wasn't protecting her heart. She was protecting her position on the scoreboard. That's the new rule of dating. If you love first, you lose control. If you open up first, you give ammunition. So instead of growing together, we play defense. And love becomes a landmine. A woman, strong and emotionally intelligent, starts dating a man who says all the right things. He calls her rare, safe, his peace. But as soon as she begins to open her heart, she notices a shift. The more she expresses affection, the colder he becomes. He starts to withdraw, mocking her for being too intense or too emotional. She's confused. She thought they were building something real. But in truth, he was only interested in the chase. The moment he had her, he felt he had won. And now that he's won, he's bored. This is the trap. Many people are not looking for love. They're looking for conquest. And the moment love stops being a mystery, they discard it. She later said, "I felt like I was competing for a prize that didn't exist. Like the moment I gave him my heart, the game ended and I lost." The Stoics warned of attachment to things outside our control. Epictetus said, "When you desire something not under your control, you become a slave." In modern dating, the moment you seek validation from someone else's response, you're not in love, you're enslaved to their approval. You fear falling in love not because you don't believe in love, but because love has become tied to emotional gambling. Every text you send feels like a bet, every vulnerability a liability, and eventually you don't fear loneliness. You fear humiliation, A man meets a woman fresh out of a toxic relationship. She tells him, "You're different. You're what I need." They get close, quickly, intensely. He feels chosen, needed, special. But here's what he doesn't realize. She's not building something new. She's rebuilding her confidence through him. He's the rehab facility, the therapist, the emotional punching bag. The moment she feels stable again, she starts pulling away. Colder texts, shorter replies, more time alone. Eventually, she says, "I'm not ready for anything serious right now." But 2 weeks later, she's dating someone new. He wasn't her love story. He was her emotional scaffolding. That's the horror. You can fall in love and still just be a tool in someone else's healing arc. No closure, no accountability, just vanishment. And so, what do you learn? You learn to fear love not because it hurts, but because you don't know what role you're playing anymore. Are you their partner? Their ego boost? Their distraction? Their rebound? And the uncertainty becomes unbearable. So instead of playing again, you stop. You stay emotionally distant, date people you don't love, keep conversations shallow, avoid intensity like it's poison, not because you're broken, but because you've learned. Every time you play the game with your heart exposed, you lose. And deep down, you start to believe real love exists, but not for you. Here's the twist. Most people who fear falling in love actually crave it more deeply than anyone else. It's not indifference. It's not apathy. It's desperation buried under armor. These are the ones who secretly fantasize about a love that knows them, sees them, chooses them. But that very desire, it threatens the identity they've spent years, sometimes decades engineering for survival. They're not running from love. They're running from who they become when they're in love. Because in love, you can't micromanage your image. You can't hide behind intelligence, humor, or charm. You can't filter your wounds through logic. You are raw, vulnerable, visible. And for someone who's mastered the art of being unreadable, impenetrable, invulnerable, love feels like a demolition. Meet Dr. Paul, 47, top neurosurgeon. Every second of his life is precise, sterile, controlled. He saves lives by not feeling too much. Then he meets Elena, fiery, intuitive, emotionally honest. Not a doctor, not polished, just real. He begins falling. But something terrifying happens. He starts dreaming of her during surgery. He makes a minor mistake in the OR, nothing fatal, but enough to rattle him. His therapist asks, "Are you afraid of loving her? Or are you afraid of losing the part of yourself you had to become to survive without love?" That's the catch. We build fortresses not to keep others out, but to keep the most tender, untouched parts of ourselves locked inside. Sophia, 29, fitness influencer, trauma survivor, grew up watching her mom get beaten by a series of boyfriends. She vowed, "I will never be that weak." So she became everything her mom wasn't. Disciplined, independent, no nonsense. Then came Amir, a gentle man. He didn't want to control her. He wanted to nurture her. But that felt wrong. She said, "When he looked at me with compassion, I felt exposed. Like he was looking at the broken child I buried." She left him. And in her journal she wrote, "Love didn't scare me. Being soft did. Because soft never survived in my house." Psychologically, this fear is rooted in a split identity. The survival self. Logical, high-achieving, always in control. The true self. Emotional, wounded, craving intimacy, abandoned early. Falling in love threatens to resurrect the true self, the one you've buried to be safe. But that self was once rejected, mocked, or abandoned. So now, the mind associates emotional openness with danger. In stoic terms, we suffer not from the things themselves, but from our judgment of them. Epictetus. Love is neutral, but your internal judge says, "This is unsafe. This is exposure. This is how you died last time." Jacob, 38, divorced. His wife cheated while he was building their future. Years later, he meets Maya. Smart, stable, no red flags. They bond fast. She lets him in. And what does he do? He disappears. He doesn't ghost. He honestly tells her, "You were too good to be true. I knew I'd eventually mess it up, so I left before I proved myself right." That's the twisted logic of someone whose inner child expects abandonment. If pain is inevitable, they'd rather be the one to cause it than receive it. This isn't immaturity. It's self-preservation disguised as control. The Stoics weren't cold. They weren't emotionless. They practiced radical clarity, to see things as they are, not through the lens of fear. And the truth is, falling in love doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. It exposes the versions of you that never got the chance to be loved safely. And that's what terrifies people the most. Not love itself, but the realization that underneath all the strength, all the bravado, all the achievement, you are still that kid who cried silently under the blanket. Still the teen who got ghosted and never got closure. Still the adult who says, "I'm fine," but prays every night for someone to see through the lie. One sentence that breaks people. You're not afraid they won't love you. You're afraid they will, and then you'll have something real to lose. Because once love becomes real, every crack in your armor becomes a target. Every wound becomes visible. Every mask begins to fall. And what's left is you, raw, human, soft, the very version of yourself you've spent a lifetime running from. So now we've peeled back the layers. It's not just fear of heartbreak. It's fear of exposure. Fear of being discarded after being seen. Fear of repeating old patterns. Fear of losing yourself. Fear of becoming someone new. And yet, you still crave it. Even in the silence, the self-sabotage, the swipes you don't mean. You're still secretly waiting for someone who sees past the walls. Someone who knocks, not barges, through the gates. Someone whose love doesn't demand your destruction, but your rebirth. Here's the paradox you've been living in. You want love to feel safe, but real love isn't safe. It's sacred. And anything sacred requires sacrifice. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Your fear isn't a sign to run. It's a compass. What you fear most, vulnerability, intimacy, dependence, is the very territory your soul must cross if you ever want to taste something real. The fear doesn't mean stop. The fear means step in. I want you to picture this. There's a man in his late 40s. He's got wealth, freedom, respect. But every night he eats dinner alone in silence. Not because he doesn't want someone to share it with, but because every woman who ever loved him saw a part of him he wasn't ready to love himself. He was too afraid to be seen. Too afraid to be helped. Too afraid to surrender the mask he wore for decades. Now, he would give everything for one more chance. To be scared and choose love anyway. But he knows. That chance is gone. So the question is, will you die safe or live vulnerable? Will you spend your life running from love or finally admit that what you're running from is the one thing that might save you? Because love, real love, will never come to the version of you who hides. It only meets the version of you who's willing to stand naked in the storm and say, "Yes, I'm terrified, but I'm ready." This isn't about finding love. This is about becoming someone who's not afraid to receive it. Not because it won't hurt, but because the pain of never trying hurts more. Now ask yourself, brutally, honestly, what's scarier, falling in love or never falling at all? So what now? Do you keep running? Keep pretending you don't care? Keep choosing numbness over connection because at least it doesn't leave scars? Or do you finally admit the truth? You do want love. You do crave closeness, but you're terrified of who you might become if you finally let someone all the way in. Here's what no one tells you. Healing doesn't mean the fear disappears. It means you walk forward anyway, with the fear, with the memories, with the trembling. Because love isn't found when you're perfectly ready. It's found when you're brave enough to show up broken. To risk rejection, to be seen and stay anyway. The Stoics believed that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. So maybe falling in love isn't a weakness. Maybe it's the ultimate act of courage. So to everyone out there building walls around their heart, here's the final question. What's more terrifying, falling in love or living your whole life without ever experiencing it at all? The answer is yours.